Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at the Climate Adaptation Research Symposium. And thank you for joining us in this session on local planning for resilience and equitable solutions to extreme heat. My name is Kelly Turner, and I'm going to be moderating this session today. And we have 4 speakers, including myself. And I just wanted to give a couple of points. We're going to have everyone speak approximately 13, 14 minutes with some time for clarification Q&A after the speeches. And then at the very end, we'll have a little bit of time for kind of bigger cross-cutting questions, should anyone have those. And just a little bit of a motivation for why we are all here today. So extreme heat, there's this oft-cited statistic in the extreme heat literature that more deaths are attributable to extreme heat than all other weather-related disasters combined. And that kind of, along with urban heat island, increasingly entering sort of mainstream lexicon in sort of planning and policy practice, there's this concern that the risk of extreme heat is attenuated in both sort of the public imagination, but also in media representations, because it's sort of this, it plays out as a hidden disaster, as a secondary impact, as this slow moving disaster, and it disproportionately harms marginalized groups. And so all of these factors that sort of make it a hidden disaster also make it a really, make it crucial to look at it from sort of a social science perspective, dealing with both understanding it and also dealing with the consequences. So we must involve the social sciences, but there's sort of a research vacuum in that area. So I'm really excited today to be hosting this session where we're going to hopefully begin to chip away at that research gap. And so today you're going to be hearing talks that try to make sense of what we know and what we don't know about the people, the policies, the planning dimensions of urban heat. And so with that, I would like to go ahead and get started, thanking to our collaborators and to our sponsors. Let's see, push the audience, bear with me here with the tech. Our speakers today will be Ladd Keith from the University of Arizona, Sara Meerow from Arizona State University, CJ Gabbe from Santa Clarita University, and myself from UCLA. And so first up, we will hear from Ladd Keith, who's going to set the scene for us with an overview of the literature that we do have on planning for extreme heat. So with that, I welcome Ladd to our online stage.
Great, thank you so much, Kelly. So like Kelly mentioned, my name is Ladd Keith, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. And I'll be presenting a literature review that Sara Meerow, my colleague at Arizona State University, and Tess Wagner, who's now at Pima County, conducted. So like Kelly nicely framed for us, extreme heat is very much a relevant and increasing climate risk, despite being sometimes thought of as an invisible climate risk. And what this means is we're going to see continued increases in the intensity, duration, and frequency of extreme heat events like heat waves. And for those of us in the Southwest, we've been kind of living through a summer of record extreme heat. This graphic just shows the Southwest heat wave and its extent on September 6th. And it looks like we're going into another one of those extreme heat events in early October, unfortunately, too. But contributors to extreme heat, of course, natural weather variability is one of them, as well as, of course, climate change. And like Kelly mentioned, the urban heat island effect. And what I think is important to mention that Kelly touched on, too, is that extreme heat is both an acute and a chronic risk. So, of course, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to those heat waves and those extreme heat events when they happen. But for places like the desert Southwest, which are often hot, and this summer alone, we didn't necessarily have named or ranked heat waves, for instance, throughout the entire summer. But certainly we did have extreme heat, and that was a chronic risk that many vulnerable populations had to live through. We also have many documented impacts from extreme heat, and Kelly mentioned that from the public health perspective, extreme heat is the #1 weather-related killer in the United States. but also kind of thinking more broadly about the quality of life and what that does to communities if they're not able to have their children go outside and play at certain times of the day as it gets hotter. It also has documented economic impacts to local economies. And lots of research has shown that during these extreme heat events and during hotter temperatures, it depresses the economic activity. It also increases energy and water usage quite a bit. And that plays a lot into some of the strategies that we'll be looking at throughout this presentation, and I'm sure in the discussion too. It also impacts infrastructure and urban systems that planners care a lot about and spend a lot of time planning for. That could be something as dramatic as maybe the Phoenix airport isn't able to fly planes during extreme heat, but then also things like, are we creating roadway systems and bus networks that are appropriate and have shade for heat events in the future? Also has a lot of impacts on landscapes and urban ecology, and research has shown that those are both depressed and harmed by increasing temperatures, especially if we're not planning for future temperature increases in cities. And I think the most important point, the last one, is that current planning ideals, such as things like increased density and walkability, are absolutely impacted and negatively impacted by increasing temperatures. So as planners are looking to densify cities and get people out of their cars and walking and using alternative modes of transportation, those things are absolutely harmed by increasing temperatures unless we plan for them appropriately. So kind of to delve a little bit more into planning in extreme heat, obviously there's a complex interplay of climate change and the urban heat island effect when we're thinking about cities and urban areas. And what I want to point out here is, of course, cities have both the opportunity to contribute more greenhouse gases to climate change and continue to develop in a way that increases the urban heat island effect. But we also have a really large opportunity to decrease those greenhouse gas emissions and decrease the urban heat island effect from new development that we are putting in our cities. Increased heat health risks are absolutely more harmful to vulnerable populations, and that's been well established in the literature. So this is very much an equity issue. And there's been 2 papers just this year, and then some press coverage by the New York Times that outlined the legacy of redlining and extreme heat and urban heat island effect, with those areas that were redlined in the past still showing up as some of the hottest areas in cities. And unfortunately, in cities that don't have a history of redlining, we still see those trends today, where often the most marginalized and lower income areas of the cities are the hottest. So kind of what do planners think about heat? APA did a survey in 2018 that found that 70% of US planners were worried about extreme heat, and they ranked heat 4th out of 14 hazards. But despite that concern of concern over extreme heat and kind of the growing documentation of its impacts, there was an assessment of 3,500 online climate adaptation resources that found that only 4% of those focused on extreme heat. And I would say that that's been, the last year, more of those resources have started to come out, which has been a very positive thing. But 4% compared to the other climate risks like sea level rise and urban flooding is quite a low number. So there's absolutely a disconnect between the concern and the resources available for planners to know how to deal with this risk. So that is kind of a background. Myself, Sara Meerow, and Tess Wagner did a systematic literature review of the current state of extreme heat planning. And what we did was search Scopus for all English language papers with urban heat, extreme heat, or planning in the title, abstract, or keywords. And that resulted in 589 articles that, through inclusion and exclusion, we boiled it down to 21 papers that we did an in-depth review of. And so just some stats from that total group of 589 papers, 60% of those papers were written in the last 5 years, which I think is a really astounding number, just to show kind of the growth in research and interest in this topic. And it makes sense that a lot of that hasn't trickled down into practice just yet. Looking at the focus of those extreme heat papers, and again, this is from that larger 589 papers that we pulled, we found that almost 70% of those papers were focused on mapping and modeling extreme heat. So those would be the urban heat island papers. 14% were focused more on design aspects of how to mitigate for heat, and only 7% were focused on planning processes. And that's the one that we really wanted to focus on in our literature review, was to see how cities are planning and governing for extreme heat. And then just the geographic focus of publications, a couple of things to note here. So China and the United States, produce the majority of the world's research anyway. So seeing them in the top 2 positions out of those 589 papers isn't surprising. I think it is notable that Australia was the third place. So Australia researchers are doing quite a bit of research since it's a climate risk that is very relevant to them. And I think it's also notable that many areas in the global south are not represented on this list. And so there's absolutely a disconnect between the literature being produced and the vulnerable populations in those global south locations. So that's something to absolutely watch out for. Some of the themes that we found looking through those papers, institutional challenges and opportunities. So one was that extreme heat research is being very much being done in silos right now, where there's public health research, there's climatology research, there's urban heat island mapping and modeling research, and then there's kind of the planning and designing for extreme heat research. And so breaking down the silos was one big thing that we saw. Mainstreaming and needing to have that information at appropriate scales was another big point. And so a lot of the research is kind of like at a regional scale, but maybe not talking about what decision makers can do in their specific location or at the site scale. We also found that across the world, this is not just the United States focused, there's a lack of legal structures needed for extreme heat planning. And so a United States example of that is where we have FEMA floodplain maps and local floodplain management departments. Kind of across the world, we saw the papers just continually talking about the lack of legal precedent and legal structures for extreme heat planning compared with other climate risks. And then, of course, acknowledging complexities, different priorities, and limited resources, which is absolutely not limited to extreme heat, but it is important to acknowledge that. We found there were two major categories in these planning papers for addressing extreme heat. One big bucket was risk management. The important thing to note here is that the focus was managing heat as an emergency issue. And again, that goes to kind of our attention towards those extreme heat events and heat waves. And so we definitely saw that there was a focus on those emergency issues, but not as much of a focus on managing heat as a chronic risk, which has a lot of equity implications that I'm sure we'll discuss later on. Focus on things like cooling centers and emergency response versus equitable housing and safe living conditions would be kind of a disparity that we saw. And so we also saw many of the papers talked about a need to understand and address the root causes of vulnerability. We also saw quite a few papers talk about the design of the built environment, and notable that those design strategies are very location specific. And so some things that would be recommended in one paper would absolutely only be for that paper's case study in, say, a temperate climate or a hot, humid climate, and would not translate very well to a hot, arid climate. So a lot of those design strategies are very location specific. And then there was also a focus on technical and material solutions. And I would also add there's not much interplay between those two buckets. So the risk management strategies and the design of the built environment strategies were often done very separated. This will surprise almost no one who's worked anywhere near extreme heat, but vegetation was one of the top design solutions that the papers talked about. This includes things like urban forestry, green infrastructure, green roofs and walls, and parks and open space. We also saw a lot of papers talking about buildings and urban infrastructure. So things like the building orientation, shaping, and massing. That's an example from the University of Arizona of our ENR2 building, the picture that has been designed after a natural slot canyon to replicate some of those shaded features. We also saw papers talking about updating building standards and then weatherization of existing buildings. And that's particularly important in larger, older cities that have a lot of existing building stock. And then, of course, adoption of air conditioning was something that was mentioned quite a bit too. Many of the papers talked about land use and urban form, and that includes things like urban geometry, ventilation corridors, location, size of parks and open space, water features, and then also tying the importance of land conservation and preservation of open space and natural open areas, and that benefit for the urban heat island effect. And then kind of thinking about all those design strategies, there's a lot of discussion, and we wrote about complexities, trade-offs, and maladaptation. So a complexity in how all of these various strategies interact, and the scale of the strategy versus the scale of benefit. And so you might paint a white roof on top of a skyscraper or a large apartment building that has benefits inside of that apartment building, but the people on the street walking by that apartment building still feel the heat. And so kind of what strategies are we using and what scale are the benefits of? Weighing the trade-offs between heat mitigation and other goals. And you can see a picture of green infrastructure from Tucson. And obviously in the Southwest, we have lots of water conservation concerns. And so are we planting urban forestry that can be completely supported by natural rainwater runoff, or do we have to irrigate those? And how does that interplay with other things that we're trying to achieve? Danger of maladaptation for mitigation strategies. And absolutely the adoption of air conditioning is an equity issue. But if we, as those cities at those thresholds that need to continue to adopt air conditioning to make those living spaces safe, do that without thinking through the weatherization and kind of energy efficiency aspects, they might be unintentionally increasing their greenhouse gas emissions. And then positive note, some of the papers talked about the fact that existing energy efficiency and sustainability goals may have unrecognized heat reduction benefits, but we haven't made that connection very clearly yet. So wrapping up, we also talked about information uses and areas of needs, and that includes need for more focus and appropriate use of UHI modeling and mapping, and very limited use of climate change projections we saw in the papers. There needs to be more information on heat health risks and vulnerabilities, and need to quantify cost and benefits of those heat mitigation strategies. And importantly, the research being produced is not always useful for decision makers, and even if it is useful, because it is a relatively new topic in practice, decision makers often lack the training to use that information. So some recommendations and future research directions that we point out. The research being produced is largely focused on that modeling and mapping versus the planning and governance processes. So to take it to the next step, we really need to understand how to govern and implement some of those things that research has pointed out and discovered. We need to increase the usability of extreme heat research. And in our paper, we talked a little bit about co-production being a possible avenue. And then also decision makers, like I mentioned, lack the training to use the information being produced. And the importance of mainstreaming that extreme heat into relevant departments and processes. And then again, just the equity issue where even in the design of the built environment topics, it's usually a technical and material solution focus rather than addressing those social inequities that exist in cities. So in conclusion, we really do think that the planning profession is very well suited to advance extreme heat resilience. One reason is that extreme heat has no problem owner like some other climate risks do. And because our current planning ideals, and again, some things like sustainability, density, walkability, are both impacted by and impact changing urban climates. And again, both the urban heat island effect and climate change. Planning has a history of, and expertise of working across disciplines, public health, climatology, all of those different disciplines, and a commitment to health and safety of communities and a responsibility to address climate change. And very importantly, planning is where those regulatory tools live that play a very important role in shaping land use and urban form, and also have a history of engaging stakeholders. And by engaging those stakeholders in solutions for those heat-related policies, we can improve outcomes. So with that, I think my time is up, and I'll turn it back to Kelly. I will note that the paper is available at tinyurl.com/extreme heat planning. So thank you, Kelly.
You have a couple questions that have come in. So I think we can do one question and then move on.
Sure.
So I'll give you the easy one, and then maybe you can touch upon the bigger one, and we can all talk about the bigger one at the end. So the easy one is there a shared or common definition or format of a definition for extreme heat? The bigger question is about naming heat events and whether or not you think there's enough information out there to create an appropriate protocol for doing so.
Yeah, those are two great questions. So the general, there's no good definition for extreme heat. It's used different in practice versus research. I would say it's generally recognized as heat above the normal heat, right? So unfortunately, in different cities and different locations and geographies, that means very different things. And so in a place like Miami, they may not issue heat warnings at all because their heat is relatively hot and humid all the time. But in a place like Tucson, like I mentioned, we've had record-breaking heat of 110 almost all summer long, and very few of those have been named into a heat wave event. And so I think there's lack of consistency over that, and a lot of that's due because there's different thresholds and different acclimatization to heat risk across the country. So I would like the discussion for sure about the naming and ranking heat wave events. Yeah, I would just say that my concern with that focus is that it puts more of the focus on the heat wave versus the chronic issue. And I think for equity concerns, a lot of the solutions and the things that we should be focused on for equity for those vulnerable populations and marginalized communities aren't necessarily tied to a heat wave event. And the fact that those populations are living under kind of unsafe circumstances for a larger amount of time than just the heat wave event. So it's a larger problem than just the heat wave. It would be my answer.
Great, thanks. And that's sort of touched upon real quick. Did you see any sort of mention of equity in your review of the literature?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good question. So many of the papers did touch on vulnerable populations, kind of the equity concerns of it. But then I would say they pointed to the need for more information on how to deal with it, the cost-benefit analysis, and understanding kind of, again, the scale of those actions and kind of who's actually benefiting from them. And we just saw a lot of things where especially with the heat mapping and modeling papers, where it would talk about this area is hot, this area is cooler. Now, do urban forestry and green infrastructure. But we need to understand, is that really benefiting the vulnerable populations that live in that area but work in another area and commute across the city? Because people aren't static, kind of trapped in one place on a map. So we as humans experience heat in a much different way. So.
Great, thank you so much. A big virtual round of applause. I should have had a sound machine or something queued up. But thank you so much, Lad. And now our next speaker is Sara Meerow, who is joining us from Arizona State University, and she will talk some more about planning for resilience. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you, Kelly. And yes, so my presentation is going to follow up really well, not coincidentally, on what Lad presented on, since the work that I'll be presenting is actually a collaboration between Lad and I. And so as Lad discussed, our review of the literature really revealed a lack of research on heat planning processes compared to heat modeling and design. And seeing how small this body of literature was, we actually decided to do a survey of U.S. planning professionals to try and understand how they were thinking about and addressing heat risks, to really understand this problem better. And so this survey asked planners questions about heat risk perceptions, what impacts their communities are experiencing from extreme heat, what heat information sources they're using, and also what information sources they need and don't have, what kind of plans and strategies they're actually using to address heat or would like to use in the future, and also the barriers that they're facing in implementing those strategies. So we actually conducted this survey on 2 different samples to try to give ourselves a more comprehensive understanding of what the current state of heat planning in the US is. So the first of these samples, we strove to be more representative of cities across the US, which could help us to understand how cities with different characteristics are really planning for extreme heat. So to ensure that we had this representative and diverse sample of communities, we stratified cities by size and by region. We used the National Climate Assessment regions, so we wanted them to really be in different climate regions, and then randomly selected cities from those groups. We sent the survey to 111 cities and received completed responses from 69 of them for a response rate of 61%, which we were quite happy with. And you can see that the geography of those responses is pretty diverse, and so we do feel like we can actually say something about the state of heat planning in the US. And then the second sample captured the perspective of planning professionals more broadly. So for the other survey, we were sending it out just to planners, head planners, or environmental planners in those city governments. This was sent out to planning professionals more broadly, but especially those that were taking an active interest in heat or climate hazards, the sort of heat leaders, so to speak. And so this convenience sample consisted of a total of 116 ultimately who responded, planning professionals nationwide, who filled out the survey, which we shared on social media and through relevant networks like the American Planning Association and NOAA. And in today's presentation, though, when I talk about this more general sample, I'll focus on the 98 responses from planners who are working at the local level, since we felt that those would be most comparable to that targeted sample, which was specifically focused on, local planners. So without further ado, I want to dig into the results of this survey. So the majority of respondents indicated that they were somewhat to very concerned about extreme heat overall. So this is fairly consistent with that previous APA survey that Lad talked about. So we see that heat is a salient issue for planners. They were also concerned about economic, environmental, and health impacts specifically. So actually 30% of the targeted sample said that they were very concerned about heat, and actually an even greater share of the general sample. Planners were most concerned about impacts to the environment and public health, a little bit less so about economic impacts from heat. And we also asked planners whether they were more concerned about climate change or urban heat island as a contributor to extreme heat, and they were definitely more concerned about climate change than the urban heat island. Now, interestingly, when we broke down the targeted sample by region, the one thing that really stood out was that planners from the Northeast were significantly more concerned about extreme heat. And we also broke out the sample for cities, looking at different city sizes, so sort of breaking them into small, medium, and large cities, which was part of how we stratified the sample. And we didn't really see a clear relationship with city size and concern. Now, we asked respondents what kind of heat impacts they'd experienced. And I think the big takeaway from this is that more than 80% of the communities, the planners from those communities, said that they were impacted in some way by heat. In terms of which impacts were greatest, well, the top 5 most commonly reported impacts in both the targeted and general sample were to energy and water use, urban vegetation, public health, and quality of life. Surprisingly or interestingly, perhaps retail and economic development were sort of less commonly reported impacts. As I mentioned before, we were interested in actually understanding what types of plans. So obviously cities or communities have a lot of different plans, and heat could be addressed in those. So it could be comprehensive plans, specific, sustainability, resilience, or climate plans, hazard mitigation plans. And so we asked them which of their plans actually addressed heat. And what we see is that over 65 of both samples said they were addressing heat in at least one of their plans. But we do see quite a bit of variation in the type of plan. So this suggests that if we do want to assess heat policies, we need to do so across a city's full network of plans. So in terms of what plans we see most commonly heat addressed in, those are sustainability, climate, and resilience plans. So 36% of the targeted sample and over 50% of the general sample said that they addressed heat in these types of plans. Zoning codes and regulations were the least common location for addressing heat. And it's interesting to note, I think, that actually a minority of planners said that their communities were integrating heat into their hazard mitigation plans. So this seems like a potential opportunity moving forwards. We also wanted to understand what information planners use to actually plan for heat. So this is related to some of the findings and discussion that Lad talked about. Well, what we found was that over 70% of the respondents in both samples said that they were using some kind of heat information. The most common were vegetation maps, heat indices, and then historic temperature data. Future scenarios were actually the least commonly used information source. We also asked planners whether they didn't use information because they didn't see it as useful or because it wasn't available, with the idea being that the latter would give us an indication of where there are information gaps, which then researchers or climate service providers could help to fill. Well, planners said that the biggest gaps were related to future scenarios, land surface temperature maps, air temperature data, and heat vulnerability maps. And among both samples, I think it's also interesting to note that no source of information was deemed not useful by more than a quarter of planners. So, there seems like planners do want to use and are interested in using a lot of different potential heat information sources. We were also curious who planners thought should be responsible primarily for addressing heat. And I think it's very clear that both samples agreed that heat needed to be addressed at the local level, but that other levels, county, regional, state, national, were also important as well. But in both cases, both samples, it was the local level that was most commonly given as a response. We asked about what strategies communities were implementing to address heat. Now, again, the sort of broad takeaway is that around 90% of the planners said that they were implementing something, some kind of strategy to address heat. And the most common of these, not surprising given what we've talked about already, what Lad talked about, is the most common strategy were urban forestry and emergency response. So over 50% of both samples, 50% of the planners said that they were addressing heat using urban forestry or emergency response. Also, weatherization and man-made shade were common strategies. On the flip side, we see that very few communities actually have regulations or staff dedicated to heat. When we broke it down by region and looked at whether there's significant differences in what strategies were being implemented, we saw that the Northeast was implementing significantly more strategies, whereas actually the Northwest community said that they were implementing significantly less. Now, in the targeted sample, the number of sectors that respondents said were impacted by extreme heat was also significantly related to the number of strategies that community implemented, which I think suggests that communities are at least responding to the threat of heat the issues with heat that they're experiencing. They are implementing more strategies if they're feeling like more things are being impacted by heat. And additionally, we also see a significantly positive relationship between population, city population, and then the number of strategies implemented in that targeted sample, which suggests that, cities with more resources, larger populations are actually doing more around heat. And this is not surprising with what we know, more broadly about climate action. So we also asked them what strategies they thought were most effective. So not just what they were implementing, but what they thought would be effective in addressing extreme heat. And really across the board, we see that all strategies that we suggested were deemed at least as moderately effective. So there was not a huge difference in terms of the perceived effectiveness of the strategies. But, we can see that urban forestry is again really at the top, followed by urban design, weatherization, and emergency response. So there seems to be some, match between the strategies that are deemed most effective and what are being implemented. And it's, unclear sort of the chicken and the egg, whether they're deemed effective because they're being implemented or vice versa. But also regulations we can see are deemed least effective. Something I wanted to call out, remember that staff was actually the least commonly implemented strategy, but here when we ask about effectiveness, we can see that it's actually seen as pretty effective. So that seems like a bit of a gap there. We also see a big mismatch between the perceived effectiveness and the implementation of vulnerability assessments and cooling centers. So both of those are seen as quite effective, but fairly rarely implemented according to the communities that responded. So when it comes to actually what the barriers are to implementing more strategies and addressing heat effectively in communities, the bad news is that planners perceive quite a lot of barriers. The most significant of those were really those related to sort of human and financial capital, I would say, or resources, as well as political will. So on average, though, all of the barriers that were, offered as choices were seen as at least a slight barrier, and most of those were actually, on average, seen as somewhat of a barrier. And I wanted to, again, call attention to this, this emphasis on funding, time, and staff, as well as other pressing issues, which were seen as the top barriers. And these results seem to suggest that planners see the availability or quality of heat information, I think, as a little bit less of a problem than more of the human and capital resources, as well as political will. And I think it's also just important to know that only 3 respondents wrote in an other barrier, and all 3 of those mentioned that extreme heat was just not really prioritized in their community. So this idea that heat is not, is not rising to the top as a major priority in some of these communities, is something that we sort of saw across the responses. So to wrap up, I think it's some key takeaways here are that most planners are concerned about heat impacts in their communities, especially impacts from climate change. The majority of planners said that their communities had already been impacted in some way from heat, the most common of those impacts being to energy and water use, vegetation, and health. Most planners said that their communities were addressing heat in some plan, most commonly sustainability, climate, or resilience plans, but no particular plan type addressed heat in the majority of communities we surveyed. So I think that's an important point. When addressing heat, planners rely on different sources of heat information. Most common of those are vegetation maps, heat indices, and historic temperatures. Future scenarios and land surface temperature maps were a type of information that was really desired, but apparently not widely available. Many communities are implementing heat strategies, and planners do seem to think that they will be effective, especially urban vegetation. But the bad news is that planners saw a lot of barriers to effective heat resilience planning. Staff time was seen as a pretty big barrier, and very few cities have staff assigned to deal with heat. And if, I think, as we see from the survey, human and capital resources, as well as relative prioritization of heat, are already barriers to effective heat planning before this COVID-19 pandemic. So we actually conducted this survey late last fall, in the very beginning, closing it just at the start of 2020. So if all of these things were challenges before the pandemic and associated economic crisis, I'm really worried about what's going to happen moving forward. It would seem likely that they're going to be even more problematic. And this is, I think a big concern for all of us who are worried about heat resilience moving forward. All right. Well, thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. I see 3 questions here for you, so I guess we can go through. The first one is, did you receive any information on what activities fell under emergency response?
Yeah, great question. We did not ask that specifically. There's always a trade-off, right, in doing a survey with how long to have the survey. We know these folks are really busy and we want to honor their time. So we tried to limit the number of open-ended questions that we asked, and have it be relatively quick. And so we did not give them an opportunity to elaborate on every strategy. So as of now, we don't have details on that.
Okay. Let's see, a whole bunch more came in. So let me try to kind of combine a couple of these. So 2 from John Bolduck at the City of Cambridge. We know from incidents like the 1995 Chicago heat wave that social cohesion and social capital is critical in how lethal extreme heat is. Did this show up in the surveys? And then he also has a question about the difference between planning for average temperatures and not just extreme heat. So shifting average climate change, shifting implications for building energy use, et cetera. So maybe.
Yeah, so social cohesion, we didn't really ask, and I would say that did not come up. I think that's absolutely true, right? That we know that those are those are issues, but I would not say as much that it came up in this survey. I think in terms of, oh, sorry, what was the second question was?
The second question was about climate change versus extreme heat.
Yes, the average, right. So this survey specifically focused on extreme heat. And we actually did sort of define that at the start of the survey to say that, these are temperatures that were exceeding the kind of average. So we're not talking about the gradual increase in temperatures as much as how they're actually addressing, these more extreme heat events and experiences.
Okay, great. And then there's another couple of questions. One is talking about the cost. Did the cost of different adaptation strategies come up at all? And how are different cities assessing the outcomes of heat interventions?
Yeah, those are great questions. So cost came up. So we didn't ask specifically which strategies cost more or less. But, funding was one of the top barriers. So I think that it's clear that that cost is an issue, right? And in terms of, I think understanding, also, what was the second?
Oh, sorry. Cost and then measuring the impacts, or how are cities?
Yeah, and we did not ask specifically about that, but I think that's a great question. And obviously this is a part of a broader challenge for adaptation resilience planning is how do you measure these things and how do you measure success? And so I think that would be, is a great thing to really dig into in the future when it comes to heat planning. Absolutely.
Okay, and a final real quick question is, were there any California cities included? And do you remember which they are? And if not off the top of your head, the person who asked this question can certainly email Sara, and I'm sure she's happy to share with you which cities.
Yeah. Yes, I think there were several, but I do not remember which ones. They're listed here. And I have to look specifically which ones there are. It's a little hard to see in the map, I think. But yeah, maybe you can push that to me and I can and give them a specific answer. But there were some California cities in both the general and targeted sample.
Great. Thank you so much, Sara. I really appreciate your talk and some interesting convergences and divergences when I go. But first up, we have CJ Gabbe, who is an assistant professor at Santa Clara University, and he's going to give us the next presentation.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thanks to everyone who's attending, and such a treat to follow Lad and Sara because I think there are a lot of interesting kind of synergies between our research. So I'm CJ Gabbe with Santa Clara University Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences, and this is research that's been co-authored with Greg Pierce from UCLA and two of our fantastic Santa Clara University students, Emily Peterman and Ali Marisek. So we're focusing, there was a question a second ago about California cities. We're focusing on why and how do California cities plan for extreme heat. So we're doing kind of a deeper dive into what's going on in California here. So the two questions that we're answering in this research are, first, what influences whether California cities are adopting climate adaptation policies, and particularly policies related to urban heat? And then looking at a set of cities, what are some of the types of policies and strategies that California cities are taking in order to address heat issues? So kind of a two-part paper here that I'm going to present. So connecting with the literature review that Lad and Sara just presented, I wanted to focus on kind of how the understanding of extreme heat is playing out in planning practice. And so thinking particularly about the point about these siloed heat policy approaches, thinking about kind of these buckets of built environment and risk management that oftentimes may not be coordinating in practice. And, really this kind of lack of evidence about urban heat governance, and what are some of the ways that planners are implementing this increasing understanding around heat. And I think the great thing is while we're kind of saying now there's this kind of thin evidence base, this panel and my fellow panelists are really doing a ton to expand this evidence base. So it's exciting to see kind of this new momentum thinking about, the understanding of heat from planning scholars and practitioners. So like I mentioned earlier, we did this research in two parts. So the first part is a regression analysis, and essentially California does this annual planning survey, and it's through the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And so the 2018 survey included 3 questions that pertain to our research question. And so the first is looking at cities adopting climate adaptation strategies in general. The second one was climate adaptation specifically in the general plan, which is the comprehensive plan for California cities. And then the third, which is our specific urban heat question, was focused on whether cities have adopted urban heat island policies. So we'd love more questions in there in the future on heat specifically, but this is going to start to paint the picture of what California cities are doing. And so what we did with this survey data, which included about 60% of California cities and covering over 70% of the population living in municipalities in the state. So pretty wide coverage here. What we did is we specified a set of logistic regression models for these 3 different outcome variables. So we essentially wanted to say, how much does future projected extreme heat, which we measured in terms of extreme heat days projected in the 2040s, we wanted to say, how much do we see this variable being associated with these outcomes? And then what were some of the other factors in the literature related to local government characteristics, community characteristics, other environmental factors, and the intergovernmental structure? What are some other factors that may explain whether cities adopt these 3 types of policies, or would answer yes on them in the survey? So before I get into the regression results, it was interesting actually to hear Sara's results about the survey, because we found something fairly similar in California in terms of about 62% of California cities who responded said they had adopted some kind of adaptation plan or strategy, but fewer of them were including it in their general plans. And as I mentioned earlier, it was less common for cities to have adopted urban heat island policies. About 37% of California cities that responded had at least perceived that they had urban heat island policies. So getting into the regression results, again, we have these 3 outcome variables at the top of the table here. And we first wanted to know, is extreme heat associated with a more likelihood of adopting any kind of adaptation, or in their city's general plans, or urban heat island policies? And what we found was that extreme heat was associated with a higher likelihood of urban heat island policies, but not the other 2 variables. Some of the variables that we expected to be associated with a higher likelihood of policy adoption, including city size and density and income, they weren't. But some of the variables that seem to also matter, like perceptions of leadership support for climate planning, that was probably the most across the board result, that leader support seems to matter, at least perceived leader support. We found that cities that had larger shares of Democratic voters tended to be more likely to have adaptation policies generally, and urban heat island policies. And then interestingly, we found that cities that had higher shares of Hispanic or Latino residents were somewhat less likely to have adaptation policies or urban heat island policies. And I'll talk a little bit more later in the presentation about what these results mean and how they connect with the content analysis piece too. So that was the first part of our presentation. The second part was doing a content analysis of the 6 largest cities' plans in California. So These are cities that have over 500,000 people: LA, San Diego, San Jose, San Francisco, Fresno, and Sacramento. We wanted to understand kind of what some cities from different geographic areas, some different histories, different experiences with extreme heat were actually doing in practice. And we looked at several types of plans. We looked at their general plans, their climate action plans. The only city that had kind of a freestanding climate adaptation plan was San Francisco. And then we looked at all the cities' local hazard mitigation plans. So we ended up looking at 18 plans in all. And in these plans, we were looking for the presence of 14 different criteria pertaining to the city's identification of heat as an issue, any data that they presented about heat or its future impacts, and a set of criteria related to the built environment, urban greening, and risk management. And so we can kind of get into how some of those silos may play out across different plan types. So getting into some of the results, I have kind of a color-coded chart here that summarizes each of the criteria that we looked at by plan type. And then I also included kind of a representative quote or two showing how some of these issues may actually play out in plans in practice. So one of the things I think is heartening is that the vast majority of plans identified extreme heat as an issue. And that included, most general plans and all of the climate action plans and hazard mitigation plans. But less common, particularly in general plans and climate action plans, or any kind of data about the magnitude of the problem. While we saw that was pretty much universally included in local hazard mitigation plans. Looking at some of the presence of strategies, particularly around reflective materials, we found that these tended to be somewhat more common in general plans, in general, particularly with cool roofs, and in San Francisco's climate adaptation plan, but less common in local hazard mitigation plans. And cool pavements and cool roofs were the most common such strategies that we found in these 6 cities. In terms of urban greening and green infrastructure, like Lad and Sara mentioned, urban tree canopy was a really probably the most widely and commonly mentioned strategy across the plans. But we also found, common references in general plans to things like green roofs, urban greening in general, green infrastructure, a little bit less so in for some of those things in the local hazard mitigation plans. And we also noted that oftentimes, particularly around tree canopy and urban greening, there's often a connection between some of the co-benefits of reducing urban heat islands with other things like improving air quality, property values, some of the co-benefits of that too. And then lastly, getting into the risk management piece, we found that things like cooling centers or early warning systems, heat response plans, these were really commonly included in the local hazard mitigation plans. But when we looked at the general plans or climate action plans, these tended to be pretty seldom mentioned. Sacramento actually had a nice reference in their general plan to cooling centers and supporting it. But in general, it was much rarer to see that. So trying to kind of bring together these two pieces, I think this shows that there is a lot that's starting up in terms of the way planners are addressing adaptation in general and heat specifically. But there's really an opportunity to do more, especially seeing that fewer than 4 in 10 California cities perceive themselves at least having urban heat island policies. And in an environment of resource constraints and competing demands, thinking about what are some of the political factors that might drive local leadership support, given that seems to be an important factor behind adaptation, and particularly related to heat, and thinking about understanding kind of like how these extreme heat issues may cross kind of ideological boundaries, and thinking about how framing them, particularly around hazards, may be a way that we think about how, we found that more liberal cities tended to have more policies. Perhaps there's an opportunity to think beyond that, in an example that came up was San Francisco seemed to have the most comprehensive approach across plans that we looked for. But, it was probably the coolest city that we looked at. And some of the hotter cities had fewer plans. Fresno, for example, had the fewest factors in our plan. And so thinking about kind of how some of these kind of local politics and framing play out in different cities' approaches to planning for heat. And I thought it was very interesting just to see the variation in terms of how large cities are approaching heat, the ways in which cities are adding some really specific elements that I think I would anticipate down the road, if we can do more research, could help us to better understand how these strategies are implemented. But one thing that I think was really missing, and particularly is a chance as cities are doing planning in the coming years, is there was very little kind of framing around racial and economic justice, or an acknowledgement when there were specifics of the future hazard of inequities in exposure to heat. So that was something interesting that I think we want to study more as we go. And then lastly, I wanted to leave it off with a few policy recommendations, some of which I think will be relevant to many states. Would be, the state government, particularly as cities are implementing new state law around climate adaptation planning and environmental justice planning, there's an opportunity to provide technical assistance, detailed guidelines, model language, a lot of things that can help move cities to think about how they can incorporate heat in their plans and do it in a way that hopefully alleviates and addresses underlying inequities for communities of color and other neighborhoods in their cities. And so I think what this will come down to is, from the local government perspective, there needs to be kind of this policy evaluation to see how are cities addressing heat today, what are some of the gaps that are in their existing policies, and then what's kind of the state of consistency across plans. And then, of course, long-term, thinking about implementing and monitoring the results of these policies as cities more broadly adopt policies for heat. So that's all I have. I welcome your questions and look forward to hearing your responses. This is kind of a chance to get feedback really early on in the research project here. So really, I'm eager to hear what you think. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, so a quick clarification. Did you look at cities only or cities and counties?
We looked at cities, but then in cases where cities had a combined planning document with the county, we used the county-wide document.
Okay. Great. And then how are cities reconciling heat mitigation strategies like urban tree planting or green roofs with local landscaping requirements and water conservation targets?
That's a good question. I think that actually is something I'll make a note of and think about. I didn't see a whole lot of explicit connection there. So I will, if you want to send me a message offline and we could chat about that. But I think that's an important thing to consider.
Were there any cases where racial justice was explicitly mentioned in conjunction with urban heat policy or planning strategies? And what
there were a few. Oh, sorry.
Right, there's a
Go
part
ahead, Kelly,
two.
sorry.
Part two, what, if any, do you imagine the racial and other justice considerations would have on the types of strategies cities might adopt?
Yeah, I think both parts of the question are really important. The first part is there were several references throughout talking about more broadly either vulnerable communities or disadvantaged communities, which is a state designated term, and so by census tract. So it was mostly focused on kind of vulnerable communities broadly. I think some of the approaches that cities could take in terms of connecting this with policy could be thinking about, as cities prioritize their investments in, expanding or urban forestry programs or implementing urban forestry programs, as they think about installing green infrastructure and how using kind of what are the data and locally that would be available about both kind of heat exposure, and then some of the community demographics that could help guide those investments. So yeah, I think it could be kind of one of those sets of data layers that could be really useful for thinking about how we make priorities in terms of, of investments in the cities.
Okay, and we are going to be running out of time here. So can you, CJ, can you see the questions? Can you type responses to these folks, or is it just stuff? I would encourage.
Yeah, anyway, I think I can. I'll try to respond. I'll try to respond to a few while we're going.
There are a couple technical questions, and then there were some bigger comments that I'm not sure we'll be able to get to, but thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kelly.
Great. And now I will be presenting. So this work that I'm going to be presenting today is hot off the presses. We actually pulled some of the data a little bit before being finished because we wanted to share it. And I hope that you'll see some sort of synergies with the rest of the presentations today. So we did a national assessment of municipal plans for what they are doing for heat across different plan types. And this is something I've done in conjunction with two wonderful students, PhD student Emma French and an undergraduate student, Nicole Cano, and they really are the instruments for this. So a lot of thanks to them for going through lots and lots of heat plans. And what was our motivation for this study? Well, I'm someone who spends a lot of time collaborating with urban climate scientists, and I know I've learned through proximity quite a bit about the tools and strategies that they have for assessing heat. And there seemed to be a gap or sort of a disjunct between what the climate science community knows and what is sort of being talked about in the planning and policy communities. And so I'm interested in this idea about how can we create actionable science to address urban heat issues. And bear with me here because there are a lot of boxes and arrows, but on the left side, urban climate science, I think you've seen this as broadly sort of this sort of urban heat, extreme heat, broader sort of heat issues, and then a specific, more public health oriented thermal comfort set of issues. And those are not impacted by the same things, the same interventions. They're not even necessarily connected to the same type of temperature. And so what is a really multifaceted concept, heat, which has to do with air temperature, surface temperature, all different types of temperature, often is collapsed into one sort of idea of heat. And then the interventions are not necessarily tailored. And that has to do with the fact that we have really good regional land cover, regional climate science around heat that has, since the 1980s, really shown the urban heat island effect across cities in the world. But we have less information about local design and microclimate dynamics, although that's picking up, and even less about what to do about it in terms of heat-related policies. And then the fact that, as I think a lot of my colleagues have mentioned, that we have a lot of other policies around things like water conservation, fire mitigation, creating defensible space that might augment urban environments in a way that influence our heat profiles. And so this is really a complex system that we're only starting to scratch the surface of. And cities are starting to act. And so if you look on the right side here, we have this sort of, this is my schematic here about how do we get to actionable science? Well, we have complete knowledge, in a perfect world, and we have adoption by cities. And I was concerned that maybe in the heat world, what we have is sort of an incomplete knowledge profile, especially around the issues that matter to cities about the sort of local design microclimate issues. But we do have action. And so without some sort of mechanism for learning and adaptive management, this puts cities sort of vulnerable to panaceas. And that's adopting policies and design strategies that make incorrect assumptions about shared contexts or conditions. So that's the backdrop of all this. So the first cut that we decide to do is look at municipal planning documents, all different types of documents across the US. And why focus on planning documents? Well, they seem to be sort of a litmus for generally where cities are going. They're big picture, they're not super specific. but they are going to tell us about what kind of strategies cities are adopting. And we looked at the top 50 most populous cities across the US. Today, we're going to report on the 41 that we've completed so far. And these are distributed across different climate zones. Okay, so we did a content analysis of these documents. We looked at several different aspects of the documents. First, how are they framing the problem of urban heat? What hard interventions, so physical, tangible interventions, are they planning to implement? What soft interventions, so that all sort of planning and policy, education, that kind of thing, things that are not an actual built environment intervention. Are issues of equity addressed anywhere in the documents around heat? What data sources are they using to make decisions? And then temperature type. So that stands for sort of the difference between air temperature, surface temperature, but we didn't really see that. So that's not going to be included in the analysis because cities simply aren't considering that variable, which I suppose is a finding in of itself. And today we will present on the first 4 bullet points, just some raw data that we've pulled so far without sort of analysis and normalization. So I want to throw that big caveat out there. We had 2 coders. They used MaxQDA software, and they were able to achieve more than 75% agreement on all of the variables, which I think is quite a feat, considering this is a really complex and highly, in some cases, highly subjective code book. And we looked across, today we'll be reporting on 170 planning documents, but in total we will, when we are finished, we'll have 211. And we looked at general plans, hazard plans, climate plans, sustainability, resilience, infrastructure. We had 1 heat plan and an other category for something that we deemed sort of relevant, but didn't neatly fall into the other categories. Okay, so 82% of the plans that we looked at mentioned heat somewhere. So that's a nice, a vast majority. But then we also looked at what type of problem urban heat was described as. So the first 3 are the more kind of general broad categories here. So general heat means heat was mentioned, but no sort of context. It wasn't specified further than just the city is hot, for instance. Then urban heat island and extreme heat event were the next most frequent problem framings, followed by health, ecology, sort of a catch-all for kind of general vegetation and water issues, energy. And then if you look, there's general vulnerability. We looked at the different sort of IPCC categories of vulnerability as well. Mostly vulnerability, if it was mentioned, was sort of in a general way and not talking about things like exposure, sensitivity, or adaptive capacity. Thermal comfort, so the experience of heat for individuals who are exposed outside was the least common problem framing, along with transportation. And we broke this down by different climate regions. I should back up and say we broke down by climate region, and we also broke down by plan type. And in the future, we also have data about whether or not these cities received funding from the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities programs or were part of different sustainability networks, and that's something that we hope to consider in the future. But we looked by region, and interesting, we found sort of the same thing that Sara and Ladd found in their study, is that the Northeast is sort of disproportionately thinking about heat compared to other regions. We saw the Southwest also has quite a bit of consideration. And then the other theme I'd like you to sort of point out too is that the Southeast noticeably is kind of underrepresented in terms of how they are thinking about heat. But the order in which the order of the problem framing, sort of the ranking from general heat, urban heat island down to like transportation being last, that ranking didn't appear to change. And by plan type, now this is interesting because it diverges a little bit from what planners self-assessed was happening. We saw the most representation of heat being mentioned in climate policies, climate adaptation policies, and in hazard plans. But the sustainability and resilience plans seem to be relatively underrepresented. In fact, general plans tend to mention heat more frequently than the sustainability and resilience plans. Then we asked, how will heat be addressed? And again, we're going to just sort of buttress the findings: trees, 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 vegetation, trees, right? And one of the issues here is that it's hard to disambiguate whether trees are being brought up because they're the most favored strategy or because they're often a co-benefit with other sort of adaptation goals. And so you see sort of this, the comprehensive approaches, that's using a mix of different strategies, is next. Reflective roofs and green roofs next. Then you get down to shade, and finally some things like water features and green walls are lesser considered. By region, again, this really didn't, the prioritization by region didn't really change. The emphasis is similar. In the Northeast, Southwest tend to be more likely to be thinking about various strategies than the Southeast. But one thing I'd like to say is, interestingly though, even though these strategies have different efficacies across different regions, you don't see much variability in which strategies are being considered. So to me, this suggests that there's a lack of specificity in the types of strategies that are being thought about and deployed across different climate contexts. And then again, by plan type, we see the same thing sort of shaking out, that general climate plans and climate adaptation plans are more likely to have a consideration of hard infrastructure. But hard infrastructure, and we know this from the social sciences, the hard infrastructures were less likely to be mentioned than soft interventions. So things like creating cooling centers, which we lumped in with a category called programs, are more frequently spoken about. And things like funding. Funding is not like specific funding mechanisms less frequently than things like programs or planning, or studying, education, these things that are a little bit easier for cities to do than hard interventions. And we also saw, I would like to draw your attention to this heat map. This is a very common thing. We see these regional heat maps being thrown up in these plans, showing kind of districts and areas where you might want to focus on interventions, but not really providing the specificity necessary to hone in on particular street segments or places where you might want to intervene. The soft interventions, again, they didn't really vary by region. The ranking was sort of the same as well. And by plan type, we see the same trend of climate and hazard and general plans having the bulk of the emphasis. In terms of equity, a minority of the plans mention equity and a majority did not. And we still see the same sort of trends in terms of regional and plan type distribution. So conclusions, fortunately, most of these plans do mention heat, but they're less specific about the various heat-related impacts in the interventions. There's minimal focus on things like equity. Trees are the most common intervention. Soft interventions are more frequently mentioned than hard interventions. The regional differences in emphasis on heat. So this is, that we see the Southwest and New England or the Northeast more likely to have some sort of plan around heat rather than the Southwest and the Pacific Northwest. But the prioritization of the interventions, the ranking, is not varying. And then we do see some plan type differences. Heat's emphasized in the climate and the hazard plans, but kind of ironically not in the sustainability or the resilience plans, even though according to the survey, folks think that the sustainability and resilience plans might have more on heat. So that would be an interesting sort of comparison to dig into. So in the future, we're hoping to finish going through these plans, do some normalization of the data, do some analysis, but I definitely would love to hear from the audience. We're at the beginning stages, so we'd love to hear what would be sort of interesting ways to use this data for you. And so with that, I'll say thank you. Oh, and this is my favorite little heat intervention. Just a shameless plug for this cool art intervention that we did here in South LA. It's called Blue Zeus. It's a solar art, solar reflective paint mural. So if you're ever in the area, come check it out. Thanks. Okay. And so we are actually out of time. It is 1:15. So with that, I think I will try to answer the questions on the Q&A chat individually if people can stick around. And then I would just like to thank our participants today. Thank you for wonderful talks. I wish we had more time for sort of back and forth, and yes, go have lunch and come back and see one of our wonderful afternoon talks. Thank you. Virtual class.